If you would turn in your Old Testament to the book of Hosea. If you have been a part of the church here at Fairview for the last several years, you may recall that it's been, I think, almost 2.5 years ago now that Gavin and I decided that we would begin a series of lessons from the minor prophets, and we somewhat titled that series Major Lessons from Minor Prophets. And so if we were to hand out t-shirts to everyone this morning, it might say something like, "I survived the minor prophets." Y'all have been so good to listen to all of these lessons. Gavin and I have really enjoyed working on them. We would not be honest with you if we didn't say that they have been challenging for us. And I know he's a lot younger than I am, but I have studied a lot of these minor prophets in the past and have tried to look at them from a different perspective, a fresh perspective, as I put all these lessons together over the last couple of years. And there's been a lot that I have learned. And so I hope that that has been true for each one of you as well. So as we finish out this series this morning, we're going to do so by looking at the prophet Hosea. In the session that we're in right now, we're going to look at chapters 1 through 3. And then at the worship period, we're going to focus on chapters 11 through 14. This is a long book, just like we looked at the last one of Zechariah. There is that whole middle section from chapters 4 through 10 that you're going to have to look at on your own. Or perhaps maybe we will have another opportunity to come back and present some lessons from that. So let's begin by reading Hosea chapters 1 through 3. And as we read these chapters, I want you to really focus on this particular thought, that God's faithful love endures. Hosea chapter 1, beginning at verse 1. The word of the Lord which came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, during the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the days of Jeroboam the son of Joash, king of Israel. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go take to yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry, for the land commits flagrant harlotry, forsaking the Lord." So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. And the Lord said to him, "Name him Jezreel. For yet a little while, and I will punish the house of Jehu for the bloodshed of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. On that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel." Then she conceived again and gave birth to a daughter, and the Lord said to him, "Name her Lo-Ruhamah, for I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel, that I would ever forgive them. But I will have compassion on the house of Judah and deliver them by the Lord their God, and will not deliver them by bow, sword, battle, horses, or horsemen." When she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, she conceived and gave birth to a son. And the Lord said, "Name him Lo-Ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Yet the number of the sons of Israel will be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And in the place where it is said to them, 'You are not my people,' it will be said to them, 'You are the sons of the living God.' And the sons of Judah and the sons of Israel will be gathered together, and they will appoint for themselves one leader, and they will go up from the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. Say to your brothers, Ami, and to your sister, Ruhamah, 'Contend with your mother, contend, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. And let her put away her harlotry from her face, and her adultery from between her breasts, or I will strip her naked and expose her as on the day when she was born. I will also make her like a wilderness, make her like desert land, and slay her with thirst. Also I will have no compassion on her children, because they are children of harlotry, for their mother has played the harlot. She who conceived them has acted shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers who give me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink. Therefore, behold, I will hedge her up her way with thorns, and I will build a wall against her that she cannot find her paths. She will pursue her lovers, but she will not overtake them, and she will seek them, but will not find them. Then she will say, I will go back to my first husband, for it was better for me then than now. For she does not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the new wine, and the oil, and lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal. Therefore I will take back my grain at harvest time, and my new wine in its season. I will also take away my wool and my flax given to cover her nakedness. And then I will uncover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and no one will rescue her out of my hand. I will also put an end to all her gaiety, her feast, her new moons, her Sabbaths, and all her festal assemblies. I will destroy her vines and fig trees, of which she said, These are my wages, which my lovers have given me, and I will make them a forest, and the beasts of the field will devour them. I will punish her for the days of the Baals, when she used to offer sacrifices to them, and adorn herself with her earrings and jewelry, and follow her lovers, so that she forgot me, declares the Lord. Therefore, behold, I will allure her, bring her into the wilderness, and speak kindly to her. Then I will give her her vineyards from there, and the valley of Achor is a door of hope, and she will sing there as in the days of her youth, as in the day when she came up from the land of Egypt. It will come about in that day, declares the Lord, that you will call me Ishi, and you will no longer call me Baali. For I will remove the names of the Baals from her mouth, so that they will be mentioned by their names no more. In that day I will also make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field, the birds of the sky, and the creeping things of the ground, and I will abolish the bow, the sword, and war from the land, and will make them lie down in safety. I will betroth you to me forever. Yes, I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in loving kindness and in compassion, and I will betroth you to me in faithfulness. Then you will know the Lord. It will come about in that day that I will respond, declares the Lord. I will respond to the heavens, and they will respond to the earth, and the earth will respond to the grain, to the new wine, and to the oil, and they will respond to Jezreel. I will sow her for myself in the land. I will also have compassion on her who had not obtained compassion. And I will say to those who were not my people, You are my people. And they will say, You are my God. Then the Lord said to me, Go again, love a woman who is loved by her husband, yet even an adulteress, even as the Lord loves the sons of Israel, though they turn to other gods and love raisin cakes. So I bought her for myself for 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a half of barley. Then I said to her, You shall stay with me for many days. You shall not play the harlot, nor shall you have a man. So I will also be toward you. For the sons of Israel will remain for many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred pillar, and without ephod or household idols. Afterward, the sons of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king, and they will come trembling to the Lord and to his goodness in the last days. Just by way of personal information about Hosea, we don't know a whole lot about him. Chapter 1 and verse 1 tells us he's the son of this man named Beeri. We don't know anything about his upbringing, about his family life, about maybe what his occupation was before God called him to be his messenger, his prophet. We do know, not from the text here, but just looking at other information, that his name means salvation or help, or perhaps God is salvation or God is help. He most likely lived in Israel in the northern kingdom, this being during the time when the people of God were divided into the northern and southern kingdoms. But we do know that he prophesied to the northern kingdom Israel in the days of these kings that he mentions here in chapter 1 and verse 1. And specifically he mentions Jeroboam. This is not the first Jeroboam. This is Jeroboam the second, and several of the kings that are mentioned here of Judah. So while we don't know exactly when Hosea prophesied, it was probably somewhere in the 750s to 720s BC. And I think it's almost certainly before Israel, the northern kingdom, goes into Assyrian captivity in 722, 721 BC, because he doesn't say anything about that in his book here. So he's speaking in the years leading up to God's people going into captivity. During this particular time, what was going on in the northern kingdom during the reign of Jeroboam II, we know that Israel was materially, financially prosperous, but they were very spiritually poor. And as we've already seen here in chapters 1 through 3, as you'll see if you take the time, hopefully, to read through chapters 4 and 10, as we look later on today at chapters 11 through 14, spiritual adultery was running rampant, that the people have turned totally away from God. They are going after false gods. They are becoming idolaters. And so, because that's what the situation was spiritually and morally among God's people, God sends then His messenger, Hosea, to deliver His message. And it is a message that highlights both Israel and their unfaithfulness, their infidelity to God, but also at the same time it highlights the faithfulness of God. And that's what I really want us to focus on in this session this morning. We're going to talk about the unfaithfulness of Israel for a few minutes. And I want to do that not to just for us to get into a negative mindset this morning in our lesson, but I don't know how you can really see and understand and appreciate the faithful love of God without first seeing the unfaithfulness of Israel. If you take the time, and I hope again you do, to read and to reflect on Hosea chapters 4 through 10, you will find, at least in my mind, that particular section of the book kind of describes the unfaithfulness of God's people to God Himself in what I would call standard prophetic language. There are a lot of pictures, there are a lot of expressions, I think, that are found or at least similar in other prophets that we have looked at through this particular series. And yet I believe God takes a unique approach to describe the unfaithfulness of God, or the unfaithfulness of Israel here in chapters 1 through 3. This is not something that appears in all of the prophets, at least the way that God describes it here. Because God is calling upon His servant, His messenger Hosea, to experience basically what he was experiencing, to feel what he felt in this relationship with his people. He instructed him, as we read there from chapter 1 and verse 2, I want you, Hosea, my faithful servant, I want you to take to yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry. Now, if you were Hosea and you heard God say this to you, you might be like, what? That would probably take you back a few steps. A holy and righteous God wants you to take a wife of harlotry, an unfaithful wife, and have children of harlotry. God's somewhat strange command was surely, I think, intended, first of all, to get Israel's attention, to help them to understand just how bad the situation was from His perspective, to help also maybe Hosea understand the situation from God's perspective. As you look at some of the prophets, not just the minor prophets, but especially in the minor prophets, sometimes, as we talked about, I think it was it with Obadiah or Habakkuk? I sometimes get those two confused, but you know, God telling that prophet, well, I'm going to use a nation that is more evil than my people to punish them. Habakkuk, thank you. Some of these minor prophets get to running together in my mind after a while. But the prophet didn't really understand that. That maybe didn't make sense to him. And so surely it could have been for Hosea, again, as God says to him, this is what I want you to do. I want you to experience a marriage with a woman who is a harlot. It would help Hosea see the situation as God saw it. And it would serve, hopefully, to Israel as a live example, not just sending a messenger to speak some words, to speak a message from God, but they would see it in his own life, that here is a live example of how God views this situation, of the grief and the pain that God was experiencing because Israel had been so unfaithful to Him. And in all of that, I think He was hoping that that would cause Israel to repent and to come back to Him. So I'm jumping ahead a little bit there. This is not going back. There we go. So he kind of goes about it, it seems to me, in an unconventional way here in chapters 1 through 3. As you have probably read through this book and studied it on your own, or maybe read some other people's comments about it, I don't want to get off on a tangent with this, but just to mention it, you know, what was Gomer a prostitute, a harlot before they married, or did she become one after they married? And the answer to that very simply is, I don't know, because the text doesn't tell us, but I lean toward the latter approach. And I do that because I know that Gomer is representing Israel. He is representing God's people here. And as such, when God called His people to be His people, they started out as a faithful people. The relationship between God and Israel started on a good foot. But then they, of course, quickly became unfaithful to the point that here in Hosea's day, if you look back in chapter 1 and verse 2, Hosea, or God rather speaking to Hosea, says here, this is why I want you to take a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry for the land. Not talking about the physical land, I don't think, but really talking about the people here of God, the Israelites. They have committed flagrant harlotry to the point that they have just totally forsaken the Lord. This is how bad things have become. So not only did Gomer illustrate Israel's unfaithfulness, but these 3 children that she bore would illustrate that as well. I want you to notice the progression of God's response to the infidelity, the unfaithfulness of His people Israel. Notice these 3 children that were to be born. The first, a son, Jezreel. And Jezreel means God will scatter. It can also mean God will sow. But if you think here about what God says in the next few verses after He says, I want you to name this firstborn son Jezreel, He says there in verse 4 that I'm going to put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. He says, I'm going to break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel, that God is about to deal with Israel, that God is going to scatter His people as a punishment for their sins. Think about this daughter that is born to Gomer. Lo Ruhamah means no mercy. And I think that's kind of self-explanatory from what the text goes on to tell us here. In verses 6 and 7, God says, I'm no longer going to show mercy to Israel, although I will show mercy to Judah. Judah was going down the same path Israel was, but they had not reached the point yet that Israel had reached in their rejection of God. And then this third child, a son again, Lo-Ami, means not my people. And God says there in verse 9, I'm no longer going to recognize Israel as my chosen covenant people. I'm not going to be their God. They're not going to be my people. That is, the relationship, the fellowship that God had had with Israel for so long would be severed. It would be broken. On over into chapter 2, and we're kind of, I know, rushing through this, but I've only got a limited amount of time this morning to speak about these first 3 chapters. To just think again about the unfaithfulness of Israel. Over into chapter 2, verses 2 through 7, God illustrates Israel's unfaithfulness to Him. He provides some more details about that. He says, just comes right out and says to us there that she is guilty of spiritual adultery. Verse 2, he says, you need to contend with your mother. She's not my wife again. I'm not her husband. The relationship is not what it once was. So let her put away her harlotry from her face and her adultery from between her breasts. She is very much guilty of spiritual adultery, of leaving God, a jealous God. As God described Himself there at the very beginning of the 10 Commandments back in Exodus chapter 20, He started out by saying, you shall have no other gods before me, because I am a jealous God. I'm not going to have competition with someone else or something else. So here Israel has gotten to the point where they are spiritual adulterers. Israel left God. They went after other lovers. Verses 2, verse 5, and verse 7. They went after all these other false gods and idols of the peoples that were living around them. They were falsely crediting those idols with providing their needs. They were not giving credit and honor to God, who was the one who had really provided their needs. And so in pursuing these idols, basically Israel had forgotten God. Not that they didn't know that there was a God, not that they didn't know that Jehovah existed in their mind, but for our practical purposes as they lived their lives, they had forgotten God. And He, again, was the one who had truly provided for them. Notice what He says there in verse 8. She, Israel, my people, does not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the new wine, and the oil, and lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal. They did not show any appreciation whatsoever for the blessings that God had given them. In fact, they turned around and used those good gifts to serve the Baals, to serve themselves. Therefore, God would punish His people by uncovering or exposing their lewdness, chapter 2 and verse 10, for everyone to see. He would put that out there on open display. And He would punish His people. He would put an end to their good times, chapter 2 and verse 11. All of their festivities and festivals and all of the times in which they had fun. All of that would be done away with, and He would destroy their livelihood. Chapter 2 and verse 12, He says, I'm going to destroy her vines and fig trees and give them to the beasts of the field to devour. As you think through Israel's history, as it's recorded for us in the Old Testament, we find that Israel was often unfaithful, weren't they? And because of their unfaithfulness, because of their spiritual adultery against God, God punished them from time to time. But it seems to me when we come to the book of Hosea that their unfaithfulness to God had just reached an all-time high. And God at this particular point is done recognizing the entire nation of Israel as a whole as His people. That doesn't mean that there weren't some among the Israelites who were faithful to Him, but as a whole, they have rejected Him. I think about an application here for ourselves. That our unfaithfulness, if we get to the point where we are unfaithful to God, it affects more than just ourselves. Even as we sin against God, maybe we're not just wholesale rejecting God, but as we sin against God, sometimes we can think Satan deceives us in this to thinking, well, you know, I know that I've sinned, but I can handle it myself, and I'll just kind of keep that contained to myself. And it's only going to affect me, and I can deal with that. I can deal with the consequences of that, which we really can't. We're deceiving ourselves. But if we become unfaithful to God, it affects more than just ourselves. It affects people around us. It affects our family, our friends, our brethren. But most of all, it affects God. And I believe that's what we see, at least that's what I see here in chapters 1 through 3 of Hosea, that God is grieved. God is pained because of his unfaithful spouse. So as best we can, we need to try to see ourselves from God's perspective, as God is seeing His people Israel from His perspective, which is the correct perspective, that they had gone astray, that they were spiritual adulterers. Well, I don't want to end this morning's session on a negative note. I want us to think about what I think is really the major theme, at least here through the first 3 chapters, and that is God's faithful love to Israel, but also to think about that from the standpoint of God's faithful love to us. So in that very dark, dim picture that we just saw of Israel's unfaithfulness, as great as Israel's unfaithfulness to God was during the time of Hosea, God's faithfulness to them was so much greater. Look at the end of a couple of these chapters. Chapter 1, verse 10 and 11, really, we've already read these verses. God would not recognize Israel of Hosea's day as His people, but because of His faithful love, He says He would once again have a people to call His own. That He was remembering His covenant that He made first to Abraham and then renewed to Isaac and to Jacob and to Joseph and to the generations to come. It was because of God's faithful love that He just didn't say, I'm totally done with having a people. No, He says, once again, I'm going to have a people to call my own. And as His covenant people, notice what He says here in verses 10 and 11 of chapter 1. They're going to be a numerous people. They're going to be so numerous that you can't count them. That goes back, I think, harkens back to language that God made as He made the promises to Abraham. And He says they're going to be a numerous people. They're going to come from all nations. They are going to be united as one. He says the sons of Judah and the sons of Israel will be gathered together. We might think, well, that's just thinking about God's people of old. But it's really thinking about, again, Israel maybe from the standpoint of the Gentiles and Judah from the standpoint of the Jews, that all peoples would be one. They would be united together as one people. This future hope for Israel, I believe, will become reality in Jesus Christ. We don't have time this morning. I don't think I put this reference on the screen, but from the book of Romans, maybe you're already thinking about that, Romans chapter 9, verses 22 through 26. I would encourage you to look at that passage this afternoon, because he quotes directly here from Hosea. And he says, the Jews aren't better. The Gentiles aren't better. We've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We're all in the same boat. Yes, the Jews had some advantages because they were God's special covenant people. But as far as our relationship with God, as far as our sin goes, we have all sinned. And he says there, this is going to be a glorious time. when all people who have faith in Jesus Christ will be gathered together as one, as God's people in His Son. Look over at chapter 2, verses 14 through 23. I want you to just notice here what I would describe as the love language of this section, God's love for His people. He says that He would allure. That's a term of endearment. He would allure His future people to Himself. Notice verse 14. He says He would speak kindly. My version has in the margin a marginal note that says, upon her heart. I think the idea here is He would speak to her heart, to His people's heart. Notice verse 16, He would not call God, or the people of God would no longer call God master or Bailey, but they would call God husband. Again, there is this marriage relationship. There is love that exists, that is flowing between the two parties here. And then again from chapter 2, verses 19 and 20, God says He would betroth them to Himself. God's faithful love is very much on display, especially here in the closing section, the last half of chapter 2. And then this short chapter here, chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. Again, as we talked about Hosea and God's instruction back earlier in the book to take a wife of harlotry, whether she was that when they got married or whether she became that afterwards, is somewhat unclear here perhaps in chapter 3, verse 1, where God tells Hosea to go again, love a woman who is loved by her husband, yet an adulteress. Some people think that maybe He is instructing Hosea to take a second wife. I tend to lean to the fact that He is taking Gomer back, that she is an adulteress. But He buys her back, notice here, chapter 3 and verse 2, for 15 shekels of silver. I think it was Philip maybe here in recent months that gave us a talk at the Lord's table about Judas selling Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And the price of a slave back during this time, 15 shekels of silver, a cheap price. And he's going to discipline his wife for a time, verse 3. Again, all of this to us may seem very strange, and in some ways it is. But I don't want you to get all caught up in Gomer and Hosea's relationship and miss the point I believe that God is making here about His relationship with His people Israel. Yes, God would discipline His people Israel for their spiritual adultery. He would send them into captivity. Here at verse 4, He says, the sons of Israel will remain for many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred pillar, without ephod or household idols. However, again, because of God's faithful love and His faithful love being so strong, He says that in the last days, in the time in which we are living, again, this beautiful picture that all peoples could return to God, their Creator, in Jesus Christ, His Son. All of those who would seek God could seek Him through Jesus Christ. All of those who would submit to His rule in their life. Notice verse 5 again. He says, afterwards the sons of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king, which I think is an allusion to Jesus Christ, and they will come trembling to the Lord and to His goodness in the last days. Certainly, I think there is some fulfillment as you think about Israel's history going forward with a remnant coming back, but a greater fulfillment, I believe, in Jesus Christ, that all nations will be gathered to Him, and all nations will be His people, and all nations will praise Him, and all nations will be enraptured with His goodness and His mercy and His faithful love. So here is a quick application as we are quickly running out of time this morning. Yes, it is certainly not good for us to be unfaithful to God. I hope you can see that here in the book of Hosea, if nowhere else in Scripture. But even when we are unfaithful, even when we are faithless, here's the good news, that God remains faithful. You might remember, as I was remembering about this particular point, the words of Paul to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2 and verse 13. He says, if we are faithless, God remains faithful because He cannot deny Himself. This is who our God is. He remains faithful because He is a God of faithful love. There's a lot here, just in the first 3 chapters of Hosea. I hope this has whetted your appetite to think about that through this day, but even after today is gone, to go back again, if it's been a while since you've read through or thought about the message of Hosea, to read through the middle part of this book and to just remember the faithful love of our great God. Thank you so much for your attention. Let's be dismissed to our class.